Okay, so settle in, grab your cup of tea or your glass of wine if it's a bit later in the day, and just get ready for week 2 of House Church. Just a few things I want to say before we get into this week's content. Firstly, I just want to say a few things about what I'm trying to create with these house churches. Firstly, they're not a Bible study. So this isn't about just learning something new about God, although that might actually happen for you. But the aim is not to read some scripture and then say the right answers. That's not what I'm wanting to get out of these house groups. Really, my hope is that as we're gathered amongst one another and working our way through the Beatitudes and discussing and praying and do certain things, that we will actually be both provoked and encouraged to live more in the Jesus way. So I want these to be a place of growth and encouragement, and also a little bit provoking at times, in the stuff that we share and in the stuff that we think about. So that's my heart for these house groups. And of course, the other thing to say that's, I guess, a bit of a given compared to, say, a church service is that it's very hard for these to be a passive event. It's easy to come to church, sit in a chair, look at the front, and somewhat disengage if that's where you're at. That, it's possible to do that at a church service. It's a little bit more difficult to do that in this format. And so I guess these house churches require just a little bit more of us than what we might be required when we go to church. So these aren't passive events, but you're going to need to bring yourself quite generously to these groups, knowing that you're going to both give and receive from one another and from God. So I just want to say, just acknowledge that, that might be uncomfortable for some people. And of course, you're always welcome to just give and receive as much as what you're able to. But these are by nature less of a spectator sport than the average church service. So I just want to say those things up front to just keep building into the culture of what we're doing. And the other thing I really want to say, like that mini announcement, is that for the next house church, and I'm saying this at the beginning because I'll forget to say it at the end, but for the next house church, we're going to do something a bit different, and we're going to do something called flipped learning. This is something that Luke kind of brought to my attention. And what's going to happen is I'm actually going to put out some content on the podcast and probably send you a link to the content in an email. And what I want you to do, fingers crossed, let's be adults, is listen to the content before you come to house church so that you've listened to it, digested it a little bit, processed it a bit in your own heart and in your own mind, and that you come to house church ready to wrestle with your group and think bigger and wider and hear other people's perspectives. I think there's going to be times when, for us to go deep into what we're learning, it's going to be easier if we come already thinking about things than we're just delivering content and thinking on the spot in house church. So for the next time, we're just going to attempt this flipped learning. Listen to the stuff before you come to house church, think and digest it, come ready to share when you get there. Now, of course, you can always listen to the content on the way in the car to the house church and, have ticked the box, and that's fine. And look, if you didn't get time and you forgot and you didn't listen, please don't feel like you can't come anyway, because you'll be with people and you'll learn stuff on the spot. But I think we'll get more out of the next beatitude that I want to look at, which is about blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, if we've all done some prior thinking and considering stuff. So that's for next time. You're going to have to do something before you come to house church. But for now, get ready to enjoy Blessed Are the Pure in Heart. So this week we are looking at blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. So the two sections are blessed are the pure in heart, and then for they will see God. So this word pure that we find in the Greek, where Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, is the Greek word katharos. And it has some meaning in a few different directions. It has a physical direction of meaning, which is to be purified by fire. The process of going through that purification is katharos. It also refers to a vine that has been pruned, katharos, pruned, cleansed by pruning, in order to bear more fruit. So it actually refers to a pruned vine. That's the meaning of katharos. It also has a meaning in a Levitical sense, like a priestly sense. And to be pure means to be clean and separate from anything that is forbidden. And then the final meaning is pure in an ethical sense. And that means being free from corrupt desire, from sin and guilt. It means being blameless and innocent. It means being free from everything that is false. It means being sincere and genuine. And then lastly, it means being unstained by the guilt of anything. So this word katharos has some meaning in a few different directions. And we could now go in lots of different places with the different meanings of that word. But I'm actually really intrigued by the notion of blessed are the pure in heart, meaning blessed are those who are free from falseness. Blessed are those who are sincere and genuine. And so I would just like us to take us down that road today. The Message translation of this verse goes like this. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. And I guess it gets me thinking about the notion of being pure in heart, being a sense of when my inside world matches my outside world. When kind of like what you see is what you get. When I'm genuine and sincere in everything that I do, and when I am not false in any way. And this for me has real echoes with the words of Jesus when he's speaking to the Pharisees and he's talking to them in, the section on woes. And in Matthew chapter 23 and verses 25 to 28, Jesus says this, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." What if one aspect of being pure in heart is to have no falseness in us? When we really do live from the inside, we live from our hearts, and what comes out and what is visible on the outside matches sincerely what is true in our hearts on the inside. What if when we're performing the proper, spiritual life and we're looking good and it looks like we're doing all the right things, but on the inside we're full of hatred and greed and self-indulgence and judgment? What if Jesus is challenging the places in our lives where that's how we live with this beatitude on blessed are the pure in heart? I'm also really intrigued by Jesus's emphasis on the heart in this beatitude, because we here today live in such a brain-soaked society. Like, we would almost expect, if Jesus was speaking to us today, for him to say, "Blessed are the pure in mind, the clean thinkers." But Jesus doesn't talk about our minds. He talks about our hearts. Blessed are the pure in heart, he says. And I think that's a challenge to us in our brain-focused society, because our brains are obsessed with thinking. Our brains are designed to process information, to receive input and to give output. It's a very dualistic thing, our minds. It's a very kind of logical, systematic place, our minds. When we live from our brain, we need to have everything figured out. We'll try to build logical systems of belief and understanding. We will focus on being right and correct. That's what our brains will do. When we live from our brain, that is what we'll be like. We'll be focused on correctness, and we'll try to have logical systems of understanding so everything can be fit in neat little boxes. That's what our brains do. We don't have to try and do that. That's just what they do. But our hearts are anchored in knowing. Knowing is very different to thinking. The heart is the place in us which perceives things. And our hearts have the ability to make space for that which is unknowable. Our hearts can handle mystery and the unknown. And our hearts also have the ability to know things that are relational but make no logical sense. So our hearts are a space of a different kind of knowing. It's not always a logical place. And rather than being correct, which our brain emphasizes, our hearts are more concentrated on being true rather than correct. And so that's like the place in the heart. Living from the heart is actually quite different to living from the mind. And in this beatitude, Jesus calls us to be pure of heart, to be pure in that place of knowing, that place that's different from thinking. And of course, we're called to love God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, and our soul and our strength. And so I'm not suggesting it's either or. I'm just pushing us down the emphasis of Jesus's words on our heart. Scripture always places the emphasis on the heart, not on the head. And I really love this quote from Saint Theophylact the Recluse, who says, "Always keep your mind collected in your heart." Always keep your mind collected in your heart. And I think this is a challenge for us in our brain-soaked society. And so here are a couple of questions I want you to do as a group. I want you to pick one of these. So I'm going to give you 3 options. I want you to pick one to wrestle with as a group and to discuss and just generate some really good kind of discussion around these. So the first question is this: does your inside world match your outside image? When you know there's a discrepancy in you between your inside thinking and knowing and your outside behaving, what is actually going on for you? And what or why are you trying to hide? So that would be a great discussion to have amongst you. You could choose that one. The second option is this: thinking of some of the current kind of challenges and issues in our world, the controversial stuff, things like racial inequality, climate change, LGBTIQ acceptance, or refugee detention. What would it look like for us as followers of Jesus, for us to lean more into knowing with our heart than thinking with our head? What would it look like for us to lean more into being true rather than being correct? What would that look like? Have a discussion as a group about the difference between being correct and living true. And the third option for you is this. Jim Forrest, in his book on the Beatitudes, says this about the heart. He says, there are spiritual virtues that defend the heart. These spiritual virtues are memory, wakefulness, awareness, attention, watchfulness, faith, hope, and love. And so the third option is, as a group, just have a look at those spiritual virtues that defend the heart and have a chat and discuss which ones of those you need to exercise more in order that you can maintain a purity of heart. So have a go at that. So blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. That Greek word, which means to see, is optanomai. And it has 2 different meanings. It means to look at or behold. And it also means to allow oneself to be seen. So the pure in heart, those who are pure in heart, allow themselves to be seen by God. Now, that's a really good thing that we could discuss. What does it look like to allow ourselves to be fully seen by God? But we're not going to go there today, because I want to talk about the other definition of seeing God, which just actually means to behold God. Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will be able to look at or behold God." But one of the really interesting things about this is Scripture is really clear in many places on the fact that we cannot see God. In Exodus 33 verses 20, it says, "Nobody can see God and live." And that's an Old Testament reference, but even in the New Testament, in 1 John 4, John says, "No one has ever seen God." And so there is this idea in Scripture that it is impossible to see God. And yet we have Jesus coming to us and saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." And so this brings up the idea of what does it mean to actually see God? And I think in my looking through the Scriptures, there are many ways, but I'm going to outline 4 ways that I think it's possible for us to see God. And the first one comes out of that Exodus story where the verse says, "No one can see God and live." And the story is of Moses on the mountain with God. And Moses says to God, "God, I want to show me your glory." And, it's no one can see God and live. But God says, "Okay, I will make all of my goodness pass before you." And so he hides Moses in the cleft of the rock. And God, in all his glory and goodness, walks before Moses. But he only allows Moses to see his back. So Moses only sees the back of God, like the backside of God, you could say. And the rabbis have had so much fun with what does this actually mean. And one of the things that they've talked about is the fact that maybe it's actually really difficult for us to see God in the present. And it's really impossible for us to even see God in the future. But when we look back, we can see where God has been. Maybe this refers to the fact that we can't see where God is, but we can actually see where God has been. And so when we look back, when we have hindsight, we see God in ways that we cannot see in the present. And I think that's really interesting. We can see backwards towards God. In 1 Kings 19, we have the story of Elijah, and it's the story of Elijah on the mountain where he goes, and actually it says that God says to Elijah, "I am going to pass by you. Go and wait on the mountain, for I am going to pass by." So Elijah goes up the mountain and he waits for God to pass by. And there's a powerful wind that shatters the rocks and God is not there. And then there's the earthquake and God is not there. Then there's a fire and God is not there. And then there is a gentle whisper. And that is where God is. And so God says to Elijah, "I'm going to pass by you." But he passes by in the form of a gentle whisper. And I think this brings up for us the understanding that we can actually see God in the gentle whisper. We can see God in the stillness and in the silence. And this is quite a strange one because stillness and silence tend to think, "Oh, well, I can hear God in the silence." But the Scriptures actually refer to seeing God in the silence. And I think this is where the idea of being contemplative and the practices of contemplation and silence really come to the fore in our Christian faith. Another understanding, the deepest understanding of the word contemplation, is to gaze. And so to contemplate God, to sit in silence and consider God, is to gaze at him. And so it's possible for us to see God in silence and stillness. Of course, another way in which we see God is in Jesus. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of his being. That's what our New Testament scriptures say. Every time we look at Jesus, we see God. And this is one way where every image and concept we have of God needs to bow and submit itself to the person of Jesus. And if we have thoughts and ideas about what God is like, but we don't see it reflected in the behavior and attitude of Jesus, then we need to change the way we think about God, because Jesus is the exact representation of who God is. And so that maybe the fullest picture of Jesus, the fullest picture of God, is seen in Jesus. And we need to be so familiar with our gospel stories in order that we might know what God is like. And the last way I believe that Scripture gives us in being able to see God comes out of those passages in 1 John, which I referred to before. And in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 12, it says this: "No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us." It goes on in verse 20 and says, "Whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother or sister, is a liar." And this comes back to the pure in heart thing and there being no falseness in us. If you claim to love God in your heart, in the inside, but on the outside you behave in ways of hatred and anger and resentment and jealousy and judgment towards people, then you're not pure in heart and you're not seeing God the way you think you are. It's challenging. And then it goes on, "For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." And so there is this sense that one of the ways in which we see God is actually in one another. Every human being is an image bearer of God. And when we look at one another, we see God. When we love one another, we're expressing the evidence of God, the person of God, the character and nature of God to one another. And so the last way in which we can see God is in our love and in one another. And so just to finish up, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." I want you to pick one of these things to do together as a group. The first thing is about seeing God's backside. I wonder what it would be like for you to just cast your mind, your thinking back across your life and see if you can remember a time, using memory, when you can remember a time where you can see the evidence of God in your life. So maybe at the time it was really hard to see God, but when you look back, you can actually see where God has been. And I wonder what it would look like for each person in your group to just share one instance of where they can now, in hindsight, see God and just sit in that memory space of honoring the presence of God in our past. Or another thing you could do as a group is just simply sit in silence for 5 minutes. Put a timer on. Everyone get comfortable and just sit in silence, sit in a space of gazing and contemplation, and ask God to reveal himself in the gentle whisper of the stillness and the silence, as experienced in your own heart, in that inner place of knowing. Or the last thing you could do together as a group is just break up into groups of 3 or 4. Try not to make them bigger than that, or this exercise will go for too long. But break up into groups of 3 or 4 and just take turns to put one person in the middle and have the others just lay their hands on them if that's comfortable. And ask God this question: God, how can I see you in this person? And then one by one, just take turns to speak out how you see God in the people in your group, that you would be able to say, when I look at you, I see God's love, I see God's patience, I see God's mercy, I see God's justice. Like whatever it is, just speak out over one another the ways in which that person images God to the world, and just bless one another with encouragement and hope. So do one of those 3 practices and then finish up as a group, or maybe just someone saying a collective prayer of gathering it all up and presenting it to God in love. But blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. May your heart be pure and may you see God everywhere. Bless you, and we'll see you next week.